This is Ashlyn Roberts, the Coalition Manager of Incubate, and not your typical host of the Making Medicine podcast. For this week's episode, we wanted to switch it up and kind of take a step back. I'd like to introduce and interview John Stanford, the normal host of and Executive Director of Incubate. So, John, first and foremost, thanks for joining today. I know this is your wheelhouse, but to put it lightly, the state of DC can get chaotic, and 2022 has already been off to a busy start. Would you like to give kind of a level set on everything that's happening in Washington?
Yeah, it's definitely much more intimidating being on this side of the chair, so I'll have to remember that for all our future guests. Well, thanks, Ashlyn, for hosting today, and agree, let's use this moment to level set, because 2022 is going to be a meaningful year, one way or the other, for life sciences and policymakers. And so I'll jump in with where we ended the year. And that was with a lot of major drug pricing provisions tied up in President Biden's big Build Back Better Act. Now, due to some dynamics in the Democratic Party, that bill actually stalled. But that was one of the closest major reforms the U.S. ever got to installing price controls, something that Incubate, we've had a lot of speakers talk about how damaging they would be. Incubate has fought tooth and nail. And while there were a lot of great provisions of the Build Back Better Act, we were very concerned that this bill was going to pay for some of these social provisions with what accounted to a massive tax on the entire life sciences ecosystem. So if you remember, we really were looking at a few different dangerous elements of the drug pricing provisions within Build Back Better. There was an inflation cap that went back to 2016 that looked to claw back money from manufacturers. But we really had our eye on a new proposed exclusivity system that had a lot of flaws in it. The biggest one was that it created this odd dichotomy between small molecule drugs and biologic drugs, and awarded exclusivity, the amount of time that a company has to recoup its investment. And they gave different amount of times depending on those drugs. Well, as we've heard from folks like JF over at Atlas or some others, that's not really how science works. We don't have folks singularly chasing a small molecule drug or a biologic. But what the bill would have allowed the HHS secretary to do is to really set a price. And I won't get into the depths of it. Check out our earlier reports or episodes if you really want to get in the weeds of this bill. But it effectively installed price controls for the first time. Now, that legislation stalled, but we know it's hanging out there. Democrats, many of them, are keen to pick up some new version of the Build Back Better Act. And if they do that, the really dangerous thing for the life science ecosystem is that while we're winning on the merits, we've pointed to many policymakers about the flaws in this bill. We're tied up as a possible pay for. We could pay for all these other important things that society should consider, like the child tax credit, investing in a climate change agenda. And so that's put a lot of even allies to the early stage life science ecosystem in a tough spot, because they're forced to pick between innovation in the life sciences or paying for something else, because that's what this bill really needed to do. It needed to really break even in terms of its cost, and one of the easiest things to go after seemed to be the drug industry. And that's why we threw red flag after red flag, and we were pleased to see those provisions stalled. But that's something we're going to be watching throughout the year. And so, like every year, drug pricing legislation is always potentially right around the corner.
I think that's a really good something that I'd like to dig into a little bit deeper. I know when we initially started Incubate over 3 years ago, we really were formed as an education and awareness vessel. And we're in the midst of having both a Republican and a Democrat administration, but first and foremost, these drug pricing issues have not gone away. And so I'd love to dig into that a little bit deeper and I guess ask you, what's your perspective on why this is an evergreen issue and why it is so important to tell our audience?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. Why is it always us? Why is it always the life sciences ecosystem? I mean, here we are. We saved society. We came up with vaccines and treatments for COVID-19. And yet we're still front and center in terms of a political target. And I think politics has a role to play here. It's an easy industry to take a swing at. Unfortunately, if you do public polling, the pharmaceutical industry writ large has always struggled to necessarily have the popularity that it probably deserves from the sense of creating medicines for everyone. But I think even worse or even more challenging, is just the complexity of our healthcare system. And it's easy to say, why does this little pill cost so much? But, what we don't take the time to do, and something Incubate has really tried to do, is say, well, let's think about why a patient has such a high cost if they do. Well, it has a lot to do with their insurance plan and deductibles. It has a lot to do with these rising copays and coinsurance. And so I think it's a confluence of factors of its good politics, but also it can hide, these sort of bad ideas can hide behind the complexity of the healthcare payment system, which we would be the first to say is broken. And that's why Incubate has championed bringing down out-of-pocket costs. We've championed things like smoothing for patients. We're really committed to insurance being insurance. If you get sick and your doctor prescribes you a medicine, your insurance should cover that cost, full stop.
I think that is really helpful. Thank you for that, John. So I know that you gave a little bit more of a background of how we were leading into the year, and whether or not the prospect of Build Back Better will be likely. But looking ahead at this year, what else do you
I
think's on the
want to
table?
talk about sort of three things and then maybe close with some reflections on how we can do better for patients in 2022. Three areas: intellectual property and the American system of patents is front and center. Mergers and acquisitions as part of a broader M&A sort of question mark from a policy standpoint. And then finally, we need some good legislation to come in the form of what those of us in Washington say PDUFA. But really what that is it's the FDA's reauthorization, and that's up this year. So I'll jump in with intellectual property, something so fundamental to a life science investor because most of the time that's the only asset you can get. IP is front and center. During the vaccine development and distribution phase in response of COVID-19, we talked a lot about this TRIPS waiver and that IP around the globe was under assault because a lot of folks were saying IP is this barrier to access. Incubate, along with many others, raised our hand and said that's really not true. And we've been really borne out by the facts to be correct here. We see these vaccine stockpiles around the world. The tragedy is it is not a IP barrier. There are just a host of barriers in the developing world of getting medicine to people. And we've got to be focusing on tackling that. But domestically, that anti-IP focus is unfortunately manifesting in some other ways. We're in the midst of a conversation about march-in rights. And there's a really you can twist an old law and say that the government has this right to march in and take a product if it deems its cost too high. And that's really not. I encourage you to check out the Incubate Coalition that Incubate's a part of that gets really in the weeds on why that's not what this law says. But we are seeing efforts to use march-in rights to go after a drug for cost. And that's really concerning. The idea, it's akin to a price control, but maybe even more challenging to the fundamentals of investing, that just because the government doesn't like the price of something, they could go in and take the IP. And that's really counter to some of the many fundamentals of the American economy. So we're watching really closely these proposed march-ins. And I want to stress to everyone how wild this would be if it moved forward. And I hope the NIH makes the right decision to not move forward here. Under the last several administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, everyone has disagreed with this March-in interpretation, and we hope that holds. In fact, under the last administration, the Department of Commerce tried to codify some regulations that established the correct definitions of when March-in is applicable, and cost really isn't a factor there. So we'll see whether or not March-in, it'll be something that we're talking about throughout the year for sure. The other one that has swept up, I think, the country over the last couple years, really focused around the tech community, has been a concept of mergers and acquisitions. And, M&A, as part of the American corporate entity has been around for a long time. It's how small business becomes big business. But in the U.S. And in our biopharma system, M&A actually plays an even more critical role, because when we think about what life sciences produces, it produces something we take into our bodies. That's a lot different than, my phone or my headphones or another product. It's something where safety and efficacy are paramount. That's why we have a Food and Drug Administration. We have about, at any given time, 1,500 to 2,000 biotechs in this country doing incredible work. And they are great at translating discovery into drug development. But they'd be the first to tell you that they are not great at the manufacturing processes, the regulatory processes, and clinical trials. So we see, it's as Johannes Fruhauf has said, it's a relay race, and it gets handed off one after the other. So something we're a little concerned about is in this anti-M&A rhetoric, do people misunderstand just how critical that relay race is for life sciences? And so this will be something, whether it's in Congress, at the FTC, or with the administration, Incubate will be making its position abundantly clear. The merger and acquisition cycle in the life sciences community is fundamental. Because of our regulatory environment and because of how important it is that companies that manufacture drugs have the right experience, it's the natural end to the life cycle. And from the investor standpoint, those acquisitions bring capital back to us that can then be redeployed. And it's a very virtuous cycle, but I think it's getting a bad rap this year, and it has last year as well. And so we'll be working to counter that narrative. The final one is, as I mentioned, the reauthorization of the FDA, a process called PDUFA. That happens fairly regularly, and we want to see it happen this year. I think this year it's going to have a little extra spotlight because of the accelerated approval process. We've talked about earlier this year, and Incubate's been engaged on a troubling decision by CMS as it relates to Alzheimer coverage. And I encourage you to look at Incubate's resources there, but I won't spend too long on it here. The accelerated approval process at the FDA is going to be probably a part of this conversation. And I think this reauthorization, we hope it goes smoothly because it's really needed that it do so. And PDUFA has been one of the policy-making successes in recent years. But it's going to come with some more scrutiny because of that NCD conversation around Alzheimer's.
Thank you for walking us through that. I think that was very helpful in kind of bucketing out all of these issue areas that really do need attention and will be a center point for conversation this year. I will say, to your reference of the relay race, I remember when we went on Capitol Hill and met with quite a few number of offices, that notion of the importance of M&A and handing off that innovative discovery to take it through towards commercialization really was incredibly helpful in a perspective that they hadn't heard yet. And so I will echo your sentiments on that front. And I know that you another issue that we're talking about is some pro-patient reforms looking into ahead of this year.
Yeah, I'll close by saying this is where we have to be spending our time. And there's been a lot of talk about what we can do to benefit patients. But a lot of times when you examine these policies, they do just the opposite. In an upcoming podcast, I know we're going to have Kirsten on talking about some of the sort of unintended consequences that are harming patients in some of these proposals. And that's why we've got to have a really honest and transparent dialogue in Washington and around the country, because state capitals are important too, about what's really going to benefit a patient. And from the life science investor perspective, with so many of our members and scientists focused on really hitting home runs, really pursuing breakthrough cures and treatments, we've got to make sure that patients can access that. When patients can't access breakthroughs and cures, that is just a huge challenge to the whole logic of the work that we do. But I think we have an ability and both a sort of an obligation to pull forward what are the real pro-patient reforms. So what are we going to be talking about? We're really going to be talking about out-of-pocket costs and the need to lower or even eliminate those so that when your doctor prescribes a medicine, you can go get it. I think we need to talk about also some flaws in our system. If you have a chronic condition and you know that you're going to have a medicine cost, there's something called patient smoothing that's missing. You hit these huge bills in January and February to hit your deductible, and then your medicine begins to get covered. Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why are we saddling the average American with these huge expenses at the beginning of their insurance year? And so that's the kind of common sense reform that makes a ton of sense sitting around a kitchen table but hasn't broken through in Washington. And so we're going to be lifting up ideas like that. And we've got to make sure with these new therapies, things that are offering unimaginable cures. We're stuck in a payer system that's from the era of HMOs and sort of an ancient philosophy around insurance, but that's not going to match a cure that pays dividends over 50 or 60 years. And so we've got to have real conversations around that. So we really hope Washington will shift the narrative, and we really hope the president in the State of the Union kicks that off with some rhetoric and dialogue that shows we all need to come together for an honest conversation that will really benefit patients.
Thank you, John, for that great point on State of the Union, and we look forward to that coming out and hopefully changing this narrative as well. And I also look forward to having these conversations more frequently, just in between our episodes where we're also highlighting additional guests. So with that, thank you for joining me today, and thanks to our audience for listening and sharing feedback. Of course, there's more at Incubate at www.incubatecoalition.org. Keep innovating, everyone.